All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're ready for Confederate Infantry demonstration. If you want to throw no bleachers, that's totally fine. If not, you can come on in. Let me get a little closer and personal with it. All right, so I appreciate everybody showing up this morning. That's for that people are still interested in their local history that's here. Before we get started, does anybody know what happened on this battlefield here? Yep.
There was a battle of Confederacies, or the Unions marched to the sea that come through Allatoona.
Almost. So it was a little bit opposite. This actually happened directly after the Battle of Atlanta. Sherman had already come through. This during '64. Sherman had already come through. Battle of Atlanta had already happened, and General Johnson at that time was moved over, was taken out of the command of the Army of Tennessee, which was the Confederate forces. General Hood was given command. That's when the Battle of Atlanta happened. And what Hood's goal was to get Sherman out of Atlanta, out of the deep south of Georgia. The Federal Army had penetrated very deep into the South's territory, right? And it's kind of odd for us to think about it this way, but this was basically one country invading another country at this time. During this time in the world, this was one of the largest, deepest railroad cuts in the world, if not the deepest railroad cut at the time. So during this time in the war, this was actually a supply line for the Federal Army, for Sherman's troops. At this time, they were occupying Atlanta. Hood, on his way back up to Tennessee, was trying to get Sherman to leave Atlanta and chase him up here. And this was one of the objectives. If he could destroy his supply line, the objective was to get the Federal troops to chase him out of Georgia. Sherman did leave Atlanta, but he went the exact opposite direction, which was a very large gamble, and that's where the march to the sea happened. So from here, Hood was already so far north. There was no way he was going to be able to catch up with Sherman, and invaded into Tennessee to see if he could free up Chattanooga and Nashville at the time. So what we would have here at this time, the men that fought here were on the Army of Tennessee were Missourians, Louisianans, Mississippi. During the battle today, we would portray the 7th and 8th Mississippi, their assault on that side of the fort. You had two major fortifications. There was a large store fort here to y'all's left, and then there was a smaller works over here on the right. The Mississippians were put in to kind of occupy the troops and keep them from combining forces when the main force was attacked up here for the Star Fort. So I like to try to get really interaction with the crowd. So looking at me, I am a Confederate officer at this time. This would have been late war Army of Tennessee. Even though I'm still dressed out in a double-breasted frock coat that most officers started off with. The Army of later in this war, the Confederate Army was running out of supplies, but they did tell the officers, hey, you can now start pulling from the enlisted ranks of issued clothing that the enlisted men had. The Army of Northern Virginia, those officers, which was underneath Lee, they took advantage of that. For some reason, the Army of Tennessee officers, majority of them still kept with their double-breasted frocks. They had to supply their own uniforms and weapons. So everything that the officers would have been personally bought, and everything that the enlisted men would have been given to them. They did have the chance to buy personal goods, personal items as well, if they deemed necessary, and just like today's military, not much difference in there. So, quick question to the crowd: looking at me and how I am as an officer, who could tell me what my main weapon is if I was to go into battle?
Either your sword or your pistol.
So I don't have my pistol with me. In fact, some of them sort of losing pistol swords in the war. But my saber, take a look at this. I can get a reach about this far right here, right? So that's not going to do too much damage when you're facing off against rifles that have accuracy of up to 600 yards, right? So does anybody want to take another guess?
Well, we just talked to Michael, and so he said the officer didn't really fight. So you're there to tell your man what to do. So that is your...
You're exactly right. No, she's exactly right. So actually my main weapon would have been the men that you see before me right now, or before y'all. If I had to use this sword, which it did happen with hand-to-hand combat, if I didn't have to use my pistol or my sword within combat, that means that somebody has messed up, or we were doing the major assault and getting in hand-to-hand, which actually happened right up here. So, but yeah, you're exactly right. So with that, the knowledge of commands that would have been, have to have been known by the officers was very large, and we're going to go through some of those demonstrations right now. So these rifles here, and if you do notice, I say rifles because they are rifled. They're rifled muskets. If you go back to what these men at the time, what their grandfathers fought with in the American Revolutionary War, and then later again with the War of 1812 and the Mexican-American War, you did have rifles then, but they were very specialized units. But most of them fought with smoothbore muskets. Does anybody know the difference between the rifle and a smoothbore?
The rifle end, it causes the bullet to spin, which in turn causes it to fly straighter.
Exactly, and a lot farther too. So does anybody here play football or watch football too? So if you think about when a quarterback throws his football, if you have to put that spin on that football to get it to go further and more accurate, correct? Exact same concept. By this time in history, now you're starting to get weapons that are mass produced with rifle in there that gives that spin to that bullet. So that's why, one of the reasons why the casualty rate for the American Civil War was a lot higher, and there was more deaths in any war before then that happened. And that was because the technology had far surpassed the tactics, which were Napoleonic tactics created by Napoleon during the Napoleonic Wars. So the first command I got to make sure I give to them while I have them before we go into combat is load. So right now, if you take a look how long it's taken for these men to load, you would have a pre-made cartridge. This would have been paper wadding. They would have the powder in there plus the bullet. Would have gone down to the rifle. They would have to ram the rifle in there. Then they would put what they call a cap on the nipple of the rifle. This is different than the flintlocks. The flintlock had an open pan. You had to put powder in. This one you put a percussion cap. Now, does anybody know what advantage that gave to you versus the flintlock?
Even if it was raining, you still use it.
Exactly. If it's inclement weather, you can still use it. If you go back to Valley Forge, or even back in the Revolutionary War, there was a lot of battles where they weren't able to fire their muskets because there were weapons at all, even if they had rifles, because it was flintlock technology. Percussion caps was actually invented by I think it was an English priest that liked to do duck hunting. But what he learned is that the ducks started getting used to the puff of smoke before the firearm would go off, so the ducks would fly off. So he invented the percussion cap in order for him to hunt ducks. And then from there, every army from that started to adapt it. We're gonna go through some firing demonstrations. I'm gonna get my men in a safe direction. Company. Right wheel, mark. Oh. So, in a battle scenario, if there was a lot of enemies in front of us, we would fire by the company or by battalion. The company size would have been 100 men. This at the beginning of the war. When you start going towards this end of the war, you're looking closer to 35, 40 men. Then you would have 5 to 7 companies, so right around 250 men, 300 men per battalion, which would have been the regiment. The first thing that you could go off of is a volley fire.
Yes, sir.
Company, ready. Aim. Fire. Recover. Arms. Load.
Now, while they're loading, does anybody see the advantages of firing in a large volley? if I had a full company of close to 100 men, that's 100 rifles going off at once. Anything in front of there would be decimated, right? Does anybody know that this event could point at a disadvantage of having all of my men fire at once?
Everybody got to reload.
Everybody's got to reload. So if the enemy was able to take cover at this time, and they were able to return fire while these men were trying to load from there, the next thing we could do from that would be fire by file.
So do you want to do one additional round?
Yeah.
The first one and then one additional.
Yeah.
Company, fire by file. Commence firing.
Fire.
One additional round.
The men are coming online and being deployed. This is used quite a bit. You would have seen them come online. Once their firing partner, the man behind them, was online with them, he would have given the command, go ahead and fire. This would have given time for the rest of the company or battalion or regiment to be able to come online and give them cover and fire. From here on out, they were going to do only one more from here, but they would have gone into independent fire at will.
Come to the shoulder when you're fired.
Company, load.
So now there's still other ways we could go from here. If I already have the men online, and depending on how the enemy before us is deploying, we could go into fire by rank. And that would have been about for the front rank versus the rear rank in here. What that would have done is that would have staggered your fire, made sure that at least half of your company is still loaded while the enemy is trying to react. What you want to do in warfare, the best thing to do is to have your enemy react to you. If you're having to move your men and pull your troops around because what the enemy is doing to you, that could turn into a bad day.
Ready? Come to the ready. All in? You ready, sir?
Yes, go ahead.
Company, fire by rank. Front rank, ready. Aim. Fire. Recover. Arms.
So you see half of the men are still loaded right now. If they thought that we had given them a full volley, they probably would have come out, tried to attack us.
Ready.
And that would have given us time to whittle down their numbers.
Cover. Arms. Shoulder. Arms.
Are you going to fire again, sir?
Yes, go ahead.
Company, load.
Does anybody have any questions so far? Sometimes I go a little fast because I've done this for quite some time. But, you know, if there's any questions, go ahead and feel free to ask any.
So you would do this thing first and then they would just disperse?
Depends. So if you look at the very beginning of the war, like Battle of Bull Run, they fought in very open fields, right? They were shoulder to shoulder, which they still did, you know, towards the end, but that would have been both armies. Towards the end of the war, you would have gotten into what they called trench warfare. And that was the very beginning of trench warfare then, which would, you know, was a precursor to World War I. Things that would have gotten invented during the Civil War that go into World War I, and plus, and by the way, when people talk about modern history, even though this was 160 years ago, this is the beginning of modern history, right here, because the Industrial Revolutions happened, technology is starting to catch up, and it's actually making people's lives a little bit better. This is where the rise of the middle class comes through, was during the 19th century. And now the warfare has gone into it. But it depends. So once we get towards the end of the war, you get more trench warfare. The problem with it is you still have to take said trenches, right? So that's when you would have had mass groups of people fight together like that. Do an independent fire.
Fire will. One round or how many? Well, fire, because they're all loaded.
Okay. We'll go.
3 rounds?
Yeah. So, while I have the men either deployed behind, taking positions behind and taking cover, or if I have them in the field, or we're able to take, if we're in a spot and I'm able to trust my men, or if I'm able to go back and get more orders from command, the command can be given independent. So each man would have been able to fire on his own accord, pick out targets, and go as fast as they can. Does anybody know what a good soldier was expected to load, how many rounds per minute? load in fire. It's close. It's 4. Standard. If you're a very good soldier, you could get so between 3 and 5 would have been the average for these weapons right here. When we get into repeating firearms, was another demonstration later on today. You will see where the difference comes into. Does anybody know where the which army would have had that more than the other?
The Union would have had that.
The Union would have had that. The Henry rifle, also Spencer rifle, which doesn't get as much credit as well. Spencer held about 7 rounds, Henry up to 15. So, once we get to see the difference that's going through there.
Yeah, everybody, make sure you find the last one. Okay, we're clear.
Company, run.
So right now, that concludes our firing demonstration of the infantry. Does anybody have any other questions or anything to add into there? If you're a lover of history, know about anything about it. All right, I'm going to ask y'all questions. Does anybody know what size, caliber of these weapons were? The common size was?
45.
Nope, larger than that.
Ready?
A little bit larger.
50.
So,
Fire.
yep. Now this is where the trick is. The rifles are 58 caliber. The actual bullet they would have used for there, what we call mini, was actually Manet. It was invented by a French doctor, Dr. Manet. We as Americans called it the mini ball. It was actually .577. Now, how can it get that spin on there if it's a .577 caliber bullet with a 58 caliber rifle? When you take a look at the table, look at the bottom of them. There's the originals over there. It's about the size of my thumb. The bottom half of that is actually hollowed out and empty. It's called the skirt.
In place. Rest.
So what would have happened is when that fired, that skirt actually expanded and grabbed the hold of the rifle and spun the bullet.
Yes.
So going back again to George Washington, he had at least 1 battalion at all times of marksmen, of riflemen. They loaded very slowly because they had the bullets were the exact same match as a rifle, so they had to use grease patches and push them. Now they could probably get about two shots off before the British were able to get on top of them, right? Versus the 4 that we have here. Well, once you take that bullet, the mini ball, and you put that, just hauling out that bottom, now you're able to go up to the modern infantry standards of firing of 4 rounds per minute. So, does anybody have any other questions? All right. Well, appreciate y'all coming out. Please feel free to talk to any reenactors here, a living historian. We're all volunteers. Everything you see on us, we've purchased ourselves, and we are lovers of history. And history is not always the prettiest thing in the world, but at the end of the day, if it didn't happen the way it did, you wouldn't be here the way you are today. So, thank you so much.